up next, without further ado, we have Sarah Ward, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Huddersfield. She's currently undertaking research exploring the experience of students who are first in their family to go to university. Today, she's going to discuss the importance of moving away from discourses of deficit to understanding what these students bring to the table. So over to you, Sarah.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk a bit today about my PhD research specifically. And thank you to Steph, Andy and James for inviting me on to be involved with this. It's a really exciting opportunity to come and speak about my research. So firstly, I want to just set the context a little bit about why I think this research is important. And that's because parental education remains a key indicator as to whether their children are likely to go to university. Now, there's not really a unified definition of first in family or first generation students. There is a little bit of variation, but the common definition is that first in family students are those whereby no one in their immediate family, often including siblings as well as parents, have previously attended university. So what I found as one of the problems in the existing research is that it tends to focus on the barriers that are faced by first in family students when accessing the traditional and middle class domain of the university. So I wanted to move beyond that to understand how they are actually successful. And I also just want to note at this point that it's important not to conflate the terms first in family with working class. Although a lot of first in family students are from a working class background and a lot of working class students are first in their family. So whilst I do want to move away from these discourses, it is important to highlight some of the barriers that they come up against. And Andy mentioned quite a few of these in when he was talking about it. But to start with, first in family students are more likely to study less prestigious courses at less prestigious institutions. So here we use the term prestige mainly to refer to kind of the university league table definition of prestige rather than any other kind of valuation. They also tend to have less involved parents around the decisions to do with higher education. So this is both in terms of kind of institution and subject choice, as well as whether to even go to university at all. They're often found to also have a lack of preparedness and skill when they enter higher education. And this often means that it takes longer for them to adapt to the environment. It takes longer for them to learn how to ask for help and how to kind of conduct their assignments and things like that. They're also found to have a lack of time for engaging in the environment. So that's both in terms of the academic study and in extracurricular activities, something which Andy also mentioned. So that's things like the societies and other social activities. There's also found this disjunction between their expectations and reality. Now, I know that's probably similar for a lot of students, but how they perceive university is going to be is a lot different when they actually get there. They often come up against a lot of additional time and stress kind of pressures that they previously kind of unanticipated. One of the big areas is to do with identity and not fitting in. And again, Andy spoke a lot about this. They tend to have this sense of feeling uncomfortable with the background in terms of trying to fit that into the middle class domain of university. So a lot of these factors it's suggested that they come down to that there's a high proportion of sort of part-time students, there's a high proportion of commuter students, and there's a high proportion of students that have additional family and caring responsibilities. And all these kind of factors combine, and it's suggested that these lead to a higher risk of attrition. So as we can see from these things, a lot of the research does focus on what they're lacking, what they're deficient in, what barriers they face, and these are definitely important issues. We need to understand what barriers people face so that we can try to reduce them. But what I wanted to do with my research was to go beyond this and to understand how they are actually successful, and to try and move those discourses on a little bit. So my research asks, what factors enable first in family students to be successful in higher education? So my sample for this research was 30 first in family postgraduate students at post-1992 university in the north of England. So I decided to have a sample of postgraduate rather than undergraduate students, because I was working on the premise that postgraduate students have already achieved some level of success in higher education. So they've managed to access the environment, they've managed to navigate through the environment and come out with the degree. But further to that, they've actually wanted to stay in higher education. For whatever reason, they've wanted to continue and be successful in that environment. So I conducted semi-structured interviews with my participants, and we focused on kind of family background, educational trajectory, and their experience at university. So the underpinning, the theoretical underpinning for my research draws on the theory of capital by Bourdieu. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of the theory, so I won't bore you too much with the details, but I'm kind of basing it on the three main types of capital, which are economic, cultural, and social. So economic referring to access to income and possessions, cultural referring to knowledge and skills and things like that, and social relating to kind of networks and relationships that they have access to. So when discussing first in family students in terms of the theory of capital, they often place these students as lacking in capital. But the problem I find with that is that we all have types of capital. We all have varying levels of capital. The problem arises between the type of capital that you have and whether it is valued in the place where you need it to be valued. So, you know, in the discussions around capital with first in family students, they suggest that they don't have the capitals that are needed for university. But what they do have are some capitals, they're just not the ones that are traditionally valued in university. So at the moment, I'm in kind of my initial stages of analysis. But what I wanted to do today was to just share a few quotes with you from my data and my participants that highlight some of the things that they bring to higher education that enable them to be successful, but are not things that you would maybe traditionally class as something which are valued in that environment. So the first one is here. So the one thing that I think that always sticks in my head is like, you don't want to be like me and your mum. So I'm guessing that's one thing. He's like, school is your chance to come. It's your foreground to become better and achieve what you want. And then I did start to listen to him and thought, yeah, I don't want to be like my mum. I don't want to be buttering sandwiches. So she did further go on to say later, not that there's anything wrong with buttering sandwiches, but she's drawing on these discussions with her family who value education, regardless of the fact that they have lower levels of education themselves. So what she's actually doing with that is using that as inspiration and a motivator to enter higher education and to be successful from it. It's increasing her aspirations and increasing her kind of strive for social mobility. The second quote I want to share with you is this. I've always been quite outspoken and quite like, I say it as it is. They got to know that I were right, I don't understand this, sort it out or explain it to me or whatever. Whereas they'd be like, oh, I'm supposed to know, and we're more embarrassed to ask questions. And I was like, I don't care if you think I'm thick, just explain. I'd rather have someone think I'm thick, but then be able to do the assignments than sit and think I've no idea what we're supposed to be doing. So here she refers to herself as being outspoken, which I think has often got quite negative connotations. But what she's actually drawing on in the context of this quote is her experiences in earlier education, where she learned that not being outspoken wasn't the way that she would learn. The only way that she could learn was to not be afraid and to be confident that she didn't care whether people thought she was thick. She just wanted to, you know, actively engage in the learning experience. So the third and final quote I'm going to share with you is this. So to come as far as I've come from a background that I've come from, you have to be bloody tenacious. You have to be like a dog with a bone with it. And I think you always have to come back to why you did it in the first place. If you lose that fire for why you're doing what you're doing, then you'll disengage from it. So in the context of this quote, she's been talking about how stubborn she is. And she's been talking about this in the context of her background, her family background. So by her words, she had a poor family background. And I mean, not necessarily in terms financially, but in terms of a negative experience of growing up and also a negative experience of education. But what she found by overcoming all these hurdles and barriers earlier in other parts of her life, she built up this level of resilience that enabled her to successfully participate and feel empowered in an environment which was potentially kind of unfamiliar and challenging. And like she says, you know, you can't lose that fire for why you're doing what you're doing. And why she was doing this was to provide a better family, a better life for her children than the life that she had when she was younger. So what I hope these quotes have started to kind of highlight, albeit maybe on a basic level, is that firstly family students draw on a lot of things which are maybe not traditionally acknowledged within higher education environments. So I want my research to move away from a place where we put first in family students as deficient and move to a place where we understand and we recognise first in family students as a legitimate group with attributes that need to be nurtured. So in terms of the theory of capital, I also want to move away from a place where we see them as lacking in capital and move to a place where we understand how the capitals that they do have access to are used, invested and converted to be successful. So in going forward, and a little bit about what James was talking about there in how institutions can nurture underrepresented students in the environment, I think from the angle that I'm trying to take here is kind of any special programs that we put in place within universities really need to be careful not to place the individual at blame and not to place the individual as being deficient in skills. You know, we need to make sure that we change the learning environments that they are recognised as legitimate participants there and not as a side group of students who need this massive level of support to enable them to be successful. That was a bit of a quick tour, and I think I'm well under time there, but thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to reading the comments and Q&A later.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was absolutely brilliant, and I am hugely fascinated and a fan of the work that you've been doing. I think this idea of kind of changing the narrative around cultural capital so that actually those things are seen as a positive rather than a negative, and something that I've been kind of grappling with whilst we've been having our own conversations in preparation with this is, do you prepare students for universities or should we be preparing the universities for students? Now, my view is that it should be the latter, and that actually we shouldn't be having to put people on special programs to be ready for university. Instead, it should be about the university being ready and able to accept students from all walks of life. And that's a much more difficult task, I think. But the emphasis of responsibility should be on the university and not an 18-year-old student and possibly a family that hasn't experienced education before. And so your work around kind of understanding and unpicking some of that is hugely fascinating, and I hope we'll work towards actually making a change at some point in the future. So thanks so much, Sarah, and we look forward to having you back up as a panellist in a few moments.